Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon for those of you who are over in Europe, and hello, just generally to everybody. My name is Andrew MacNeill. This is a session on Quasar and JSON, but we'll be covering a little bit of VFP and a few other topics as well as we get into it. Just to give a quick heads up as to who I am, for those of you who don't know. My name is Andrew MacNeill, and I'm a Fox Pro developer. Kind of sounds like a 12-step program statement at the beginning of it, but it's one of the things that I've really enjoyed over the past, I'm going to say close to 30 years. And it's something that I've found uniquely about the Fox Pro developer community, is one where it embraces not just the community side of things, which I think most of you are aware that it does, but also how much it gets certain aspects of it. More so than other development environments. You typically find a lot of people that are just out of school getting into development. They say, I want to go into gaming, or I want to go into one thing or the other. Fox Pro developers always seem to be geared, in my mind at least, to a few things. And one of the key things is data. They get data. I don't know if any of you work with other people and find that sometimes they just can't wrap their head properly around how data structures work or how the best way of implementing data is. Fox Pro developers also seem to always be focused really on the business solution at hand. It's not about, oh, I'm going to try this, I'm going to play with this, and so forth. They want to build the business solution. And finally, they also want to get it done fast. Fast and right, the old triangle that people usually use, but typically it's about gearing the right kind of solution, meeting a particular business need. And that's something, one could argue it's not unique in the development world. In fact, one would say it shouldn't be unique in the development world, but I have found typically that it is. So that's typically why I like to start off by saying I'm a Fox Pro developer, because I get and I love data more so than anything, generally speaking. I'm also an open source developer since 1992. Some of you who have been around for a while probably know me as the author of GenMenuX, which, well, we say open source these days. Back then, it was public domain was the real way of putting things out there. And so I've been involved in that. I've also been, over the years, a developer, trainer, mentor, you name it, writer, a variety of things. But most recently, I've been primarily in the Microsoft ecosystem still, back from even Microsoft bought Fox Pro back in '92, but doing the ASP.NET, C#, but also from the Microsoft ecosystem of development tools, especially their Azure DevOps and other areas like that, which are geared around improving the overall development process. So that's a quick little thing about me, how we get into it, and from that point. Now, in this session, we're going to be talking a little bit about a couple of things. One is this tool called Quasar, and we'll get into that a little bit later. We'll also talk about data, and then how this information all comes together. And when we're dealing with JSON, JSON as the JavaScript object notation, it's something that you may have been exposed to, but it's also something that you can actually start using not just for regular data, but for other things such as ini files and what have you. And we'll take a look at that. We'll also, near the end, we'll talk about building and distributing these applications, because it's not enough just to build them, obviously. It's not enough just to throw a few things on the screen and play with it. You actually have to build an application and then get it out to clients. And this is one of the things that I find very exciting with Quasar, because it's a tool that it makes things easier to pull out, and then you can actually take it to a variety of different places, a couple of different platform entries. So these days, I mean, way back when, the developer holy grail, you want to build an application quickly, you want to have it support multilingual, it needed to be cross-platform. And at one point in time, cross-platform was Unix, DOS, and Windows. Sometimes Mac was thrown in there. And nowadays, I always find that the holy grail, it ends up being a rich interface, especially on the web, and still cross-platform, but the platforms themselves have now changed. It's no longer necessarily just the desktop. It's about Windows, mobile, and what have you. And so Quasar it's not unique. There's a lot of different other frameworks that allow you to work with it, but it has a fast way of building an application. And so you can turn things around fairly quickly. And I think you'll like what you end up seeing with it. One quick housekeeping note, I am giving there's a Q&A session after this. If you do have questions, please put them into the chat and we can address them, but probably going to be holding them off till the end. So it's always a good idea just to put them into the chat window. That way we can see them and we can address them as time comes up with. But after the session, you can go to the session rooms and the Q&A session will be there. So Quasar is built on Vue. Now, last year, Rick Strahl did a deep dive into Vue as a JavaScript framework. And we're not going to get into that because there's an awful lot of details that are underlying inside of Vue as a JavaScript framework. But the way I like to think about the two of them, how they fit together is kind of like how FoxPro exists as an application platform. And then on top of it, you would have something like Westwind Connect. You might have Visual Fox Express or Visual Pro Matrix, a third-party generator tool. And a lot of you who have been building applications have probably even taken even the FoxPro Foundation classes and built on those to build an entire application. And that's really a good way of looking at Quasar. It's based on Vue, but it's geared towards, I need to deliver an application versus I want to figure out how to use this stuff. So now Les Pinter has a session currently during Virtual Fox Fest about React, which is another reactive framework. It probably goes into a little bit more detail. So in terms of that, they are kind of competing frameworks overall, but they're also very similar to each other. Vue was started based on somebody who worked at Google looking at Angular and saying, oh, I want to improve it and I want to make it easier. I want to get rid of some of the bloat. And it's moved on from there. It's continually grown. Vue is open source, so but it is a very mature open source. It's been around for quite a few years now. It's just released version 3. When I first created these slides, it was still in release candidate, so it was just released a couple weeks ago. And it's a very a fun environment in a lot of ways to work with, and we'll take a look at a couple of examples of that. Now, Quasar, the other tool that we're referring to here, is built on Vue. It works directly off of Vue, and as I said earlier, its focus is on interface and functionality. It wants to get you as quickly as possible into building a real application, and so that's really how we're going to get into it. Couple of things to know to get started. When you're dealing with any of these tools in this day and age, you almost have to use Node or NPM and Git. Rick Borp did a session on Git just yesterday to get you, if you haven't gotten used to using it or so forth, it's kind of the place where all of the code resides. We're not really going to get into Git on it from this perspective, but the sample files for this session, all of the sample files for this session can be found in a GitHub site that is included in the show notes. Now, when we're dealing with this, I'm going to switch now over into my terminal window, into the environment that I'm working in. But we're going to take a look in Visual Studio Code is the other tool we're primarily working with here. And for those of you who haven't worked with Visual Studio Code, I mean, imagine a fancy text editor for all of the things that we need to work with, and then having some extra tools to work with it. So it's very, very nice and easy to work with. So I'm just going to switch over and share my screen. I'm going to turn off these slides as well. So coming back to that point again, put your questions into the chat. I won't see them necessarily right away, but if at the end of the session we have a little bit of time, we can, or you can find me in the Q&A session afterwards. So I'm just going to share my desktop here. And we're just going to stop sharing the other window here. Okay. And that should be sharing just the screen share window that's up there. And so we will just get in there here. Okay. So I'm in a terminal window in this window in here. And in my terminal window, just to give you an idea of Vue, if you've never worked with Vue before, if you've never seen Vue, Vue and both of them work off of what's a command line interface. So you can basically just type in CLI, so you can type in Vue create or npm create, and it will create a basic file structure. And we'll just pull up that file structure here so you can see it in that file structure. And so a typical Vue application or a typical Vue structure ends up having a VFF Vue source folder, and it has a variety of things that are inside of that folder. And you'll notice that there's modules, views, and so forth. We'll get into seeing these things. But if you notice from an HTML perspective, there's no HTML per se. And Vue from the starting point is a web-based framework. So it kind of looks weird that it doesn't have an HTML file to start off with, but it starts off with this main.js and it runs app.vue. Now, if I was to create a brand new Vue application, I'm just going to open up a new terminal window here quickly, just so we can see what's involved here. And I just went into my projects folder, and I'm just going to create a brand new file called VFF2. And I simply said Vue create. It'll ask for a variety of parameters, and it'll actually say, okay, well, what do you want to create? You want to create this project folder that you're going to do, and it builds a lot of the default information. So I've already created this over here, and I'm just going to run it. Now, if you're not familiar with NPM, NPM it's the node package manager, but it allows you to quickly build a web server that you can work with right away. So I'm just going to come into here and say npm run serve in this folder that I've already created. And it starts up the development server, and it'll put it directly, does some compiling right away. This is kind of like our regular build process that you might see in Fox Pro or anything, but it's now created our local host, 8080. And if I was just flipping over to the screen, I can see this core application of what it's built. It's not very functional, is it? It's basically the standard view. It has a home and an about page, which flips you back and forth. Doesn't really give you a lot of details. We're not going to spend a huge amount of time in Vue, but I do want to highlight some key aspects of Vue, because you'll see how that works in the Quasar side of things. So here is, I am in Visual Studio Code right now, and I'm looking at that same folder, the VFF Vue. And so here's the source folder. And I mentioned earlier on that there's this main.js. And it's a pretty small file. I mean, it's basically doing some imports, and really don't have to worry too much about this piece right here. Just keep it the way it is. And in app.vue, again, all it's telling us here is I have a router and a home and about. So if I think about my application that we were just looking at, there's home and there's about. It's not giving a lot of detailed information that's on here. But if we're on the home page, there's a view called home.view. And this is where we can actually see there's a logo and there's the welcome and so forth. So the way Vue works is it uses braces to deal with information. So right now, if I just, but it is purely a Vue file is simply kind of like an HTML file. So if I just wanted to type something in here, saying I am here, and I save it, I'll see that text right away, just kind of like regular HTML. And if you just want to use HTML, you can. The cool part about Vue is, as I mentioned earlier on, is it's reactive. So as a reactive environment, what's cool about this is that I can create variables, kind of like what we do in Fox, where we're just creating variables, and they immediately react. So I'm just going to come under here, and I'm just going to type in input. So we just have a regular input box. I'm just going to put a basic break on here. We can see here, I am here. And typically, if you've ever done any kind of web development before, you'd have an input. You'd probably have to add an ID field to it. in order to reference it and work with it. Well, with Vue, it works a little bit differently, because what you basically have is this concept of vModel. And I'm just going to type in vModel. And vModel is simply kind of like your data bind, your control source or your data source when you're building an application. So I'm just going to come in here and I'm going to say, I want to reference a thing that I'm just going to call VFF sample. That's simply a variable. And if I hit save, I come back over, doesn't look like anything's changed in my application. It's a pure HTML application, or it looks like an HTML application, a typical one, and I can just type in words that I want to. But the value of Vue is that it's actually storing this information as we need to. And here's the Vue file. It starts off here with a template, and down below it has a script. And in this script, it's referring a couple of things. The key thing we care about here is this area called data. And data tells us what variables or what fields we have available to us. So I had one called sample. I have also one down here called show details, which we'll look at in a moment. But we created this one up here called VFF sample. So I'm just going to come down to here, and I'm going to add VFF sample. I'm going to say virtual fox test. I'm going to put a comma at the end of it. Now, right when we're looking at this notation, that's JSON. So if you've never worked with it before, we're going to see this quite a bit. This is basically just a JSON syntax, and the way this is written out is it's allowing us to see here's a variable and here's the value that's actually located in it. So I've said VFF sample. Make sure I've got the syntax right, because it is JavaScript, it is case sensitive, and I've just said VFF sample. Now, if I come back to my application, it already has the value in there. So I can now see that I can set up my variables and work with it that way. The cool part about Vue, though, is, as I was saying, it's reactive. So if I want to see what that value is, maybe not in a text box, but I want to reference it elsewhere, I can just, on a web page, I can put it within these curly braces, or mustaches, as some people call them. So I'm just going to say VFF sample. And again, I'll make it sure that we have another extra line there. So there's my VFF sample. And if I look at my page, now I can see it's listed down below there. I said it was reactive. So what happens is, as soon as I change it anywhere in this interface, I'm going to say Fox Fest. It's changing it live. So the information that I'm referring to is always dealing with it. So it's always available to you. And this is a common feature in Vue itself. This isn't just Quasar or anything like that. This is just the way Vue and other reactive frameworks work. So that's one key thing to look at. So you've got this concept of vModel. And as you can see here, I'm just using a regular HTML element. And then I can also refer here to that actual value, just putting it in square braces, or curly braces rather, so you can see what those values are. Now, it also has a couple of other parameters that are in here as well that are built into Vue. And I'm just going to start off with this entry down here. I'm just going to open this up so we can see it. And I've got a checkbox. And inside this checkbox, I'm referencing this thing called show details. And what is the value of show details? It's simply false. So it's true or false. Now, if you've ever dealt with checkboxes in the regular HTML world, you know it can be sometimes it can be kind of tricky, because you've got this checked value that you have to check for and what have you. But in here, let me just save my screen here. Oops. There's my little checkbox down below here. And it's just a regular checkbox that's identifying that value. So I'm just going to actually come here. And I just want to display so we can see what show details looks like. Oops. Curly braces. And I'm just going to get rid of that for a moment here. And oops, need to be able to use this here. It's going to say false. We'll come down to that piece in just a moment. So you can see here, here's the value. I just check on it, and it's true. So we can see that the value is being very reactive as to how these things are appearing. Again, we're just looking at some very, very straightforward concepts of Vue before we jump into how Quasar works. Another key aspect of this, though, is that you can use this concept of v-if. So I'm going to say I want to show these details down below if this value is true or not. So again, this is a completely separate component, and I'm just saying v-if, and it's showing up, and it will show up as I check that option or not. So I come here, I set it to true, and there's some more detailed information. So this is just a starting point to be aware of how Vue generally works. It's reactive. Key things to be aware of are this concept of v-model and v-if. And generally speaking, anything that you see in Vue typically will start with a v-dash. And there are other couple of syntaxes that we'll see as we get further into Quasar as to how it all pieces together. One other quick point here is if you notice the default application, it's referring to this hello world piece down here. And what is hello world? Well, in this case, it's saying I'm importing hello world from a thing called a component. So think about a component as being maybe like your foundation classes in FoxPro. So if I was to look up here, maybe input is simply just dropping a regular text box into the application. Now what I'm importing here is I'm actually loading in a class library for a given type of element. And I can see over on my left-hand side here, here's this field here called components. I open it up and take a look at it. And again, it looks exactly the same. It's all located within this little template piece of text. And it has all of the content. You can see right here, it's referring to message. It's got a little class of hello. If I come down a little bit further, it's got some links that are directly in here. And then down below here, you see it has a name. And then it has this thing called props. Now, props are references to each other. So if we saw the earlier example, we saw here that we had this data where we were actually writing out what specific data is. Well, what props are is kind of like sharing this and making it a public variable. So these are kind of internal variables. Props are public variables or public properties. So here props is, and it's linked to message. It's exposing a thing called message. And it's the very first thing that it shows at the very top of the application. And if I look at home, which is referencing it here, I'm saying I want to use components hello world, and it calls hello world, and it passes that prop. So again, if you're getting into figuring out where everything is, this is a very good example of where it's very similar to building a regular application. You've got your internal variables or your private properties, and now you've got your public properties of what you're dealing with here. So I can just come in here, make this change on this prop, and I can say VFF, save it, and in my application, it's now changing dynamically. So if you imagine building a Vue application, or even take a look, consider your old application, your regular FoxPro applications, you probably have a ton of classes, and you may have a lot of different libraries and a lot of different pieces. And one of the challenges, of course, is that if you look at this code that we had originally in home, it has this import hello world, and I imagine you probably have more than just one class of what you're dealing with. So you probably have a bunch of different things. So you might end up getting a big, long list of items that are in this script, which can make it kind of unwieldy. And this is where Quasar looks at a few of these things and says, you know, we need to make this better. We need to make a better solution. And that's what they've done. Now, if you imagine the Vue community being everybody that's worked in Visual FoxPro, or everybody that's worked in VB or any kind of core platform, then you've got Quasar that sits on top, which are people that are basically working in that one ecosystem as well. So it's another ecosystem on top, but it is a very active ecosystem, which is kind of one of the things that I really like about it. It reminds me a lot of the FoxPro community in that it's very active. A lot of people are trying to share and help them work with various aspects of it. So this was our Vue application. As you see, I'm running it right here. I'm just going to stop it here. And if I come back to my window here, I have this is the directory I'm in. I'm in a folder called VFF. Quasar also has a CLI. So if I just type Quasar right here, it's telling me a few things that I can do with it. Now, if you're starting from scratch, this is one of the reasons why the GitHub template that I've created basically allows you just to download that and start with it right out of the box, which can make it a lot easier. But what you can simply do is you can type in, I want to create a new application, say Quasar create, and I say, give me the name of the application that I'm going to create. So I'm going to say Foxfest. And it pops up and it downloads a starter kit. It asks for a project name, which is an internal name, Foxfest. But once again, it has to have all lowercase things. I'm just going to put it in Foxfest. Gives you the actual product name as to what it's going to look like. So I'm going to say Foxfest up here. A description of the app, and this is just basically building. I mean, if you've ever built an application, a full application with Westwind or Visual Fox Express or any of those frameworks, it's kind of like the same process here, asking you what kind of details, the project description, the author of who you are, some styles. Now it's asking you about how you like to work in your environment. I'm just going to say yes, and take most of the defaults here. This question about the features is where it becomes kind of interesting. By default, it only is including one feature, but we're actually going to come down here and we're going to use some of these things out of the box, so we don't have to add them in manually. And again, this is the benefit of, this is one of the best parts about Quasar. Instead of having to manually figure out all the little pieces that you have to put in, you can use the command line interface to choose those items. So I'm going to come down here, choose Vuex, Axios, and this little thing here called I18N. Since we're dealing with an international community here, we'll see how that really benefits us later on. It asks us what presets we want to use. We'll just leave, as I said, we're going to take pretty much the defaults. And depending on the environment, you may use Yarn or NPM. I find the entire open source community has they go kind of crazy with all their naming conventions, Yarn, Homebrew, and so forth. NPM is generally what I end up sticking with. And then it just generally just installs and generates this core application. Now, if you are missing files that it needs to install, it will automatically install them. And once again, it's all using NPM, which has an NPM install and what have you to come into it. Now, once it's built this, I'm just going to flip over to a separate application over here that I have. We were previously looking at home. If we flip over to another core application that we've got, this is our view application. And if we take a now look at our Quasar sample, the Quasar sample application that it'll build, in this case, we've called one here called My First App. It has a slightly different structure in Quasar. And so that structure in Quasar starts off, it has the VS Code distribution, node modules, and public. And under the source, though, it's changed things around a little bit. If we think about how if we compare it with the view, they had a main.js, they had a couple of other files. In this case, you only really have the app.view, which looks fairly similar to the other. It has a folder called layouts and a folder called pages. There's no views folder that we were previously looking at. So if I come over here, I'm just going to quickly compare these two. And if we're comparing the folders that get created in that source folder, you can see that they have some things that are kind of similar, but other things are, they have a few more folders that are in here. And we'll see why when we start running this core application. So in fact, I'm going to come back over to our sample. Has our template finished running yet? Yeah, it said it finished running here. So it's built our application. It's called Foxfest. And if we want to run it, we can immediately do that. So I'm just going to come under Foxfest. And I'm just going to type Quasar dev. This basically now creates, instead of running that npm run serve, this is actually makes it nice and easy. It runs it directly, grabs all the latest files, and it opens it up directly in my application. So this is the template application that Quasar has built. And if you notice, it's got some links on the side, but it actually has some functionality that's in here as well. So if I click on this, you can see that it looks more like a real application. It's got a toolbar that hides and shows. It's got some little icons on it, and this. It can go further, certainly, but it actually has the makings more of a robust application. And we'll get into that a little bit later. I'm going to stop running this version, and I'm going to come over to Visual Studio Code, rather, where we are. And I'm in this Quasar sample folder. And I'm just going to go into right here is where we are under my first app. So under my Quasar template folder. For those of you who aren't familiar with Visual Studio Code, this area down here is a little terminal window. And this is going to let us see some of the application of what we're building here. And I have this thing called My First App. And so instead of having to flip over to the terminal window all the time and come back in, I'm just going to come under here at Quasar Dev. And again, it runs exactly the same thing. So it basically allows me to stay pretty much in this nice little ecosystem of what I'm working with. And we're going to let it build up the application here. And again, it pulls up our virtual FoxFest application because I've made a couple of minor changes. And we're going to walk through some of these features that have been built into it and how it generally fills in. So this is under the My First App. And again, when you're in Visual Studio Code, and even when you're running it from a terminal window, it's important to note that changes that you make occur live while you're doing live development. So it really is a fun type of way of just saying, oh, I want to make changes right away. I can. So we talked earlier on a little bit about how when we were looking at the other one, we had the router, and it was always referring to these views called hello. It had a view for about and home, and that was the standard application. What Quasar has done is they've gone a slightly different route. They've got a layouts folder, and this layouts folder has a main layout.view, and this basically tells you what your core application looks like. And so at the top here, we can see queue layout, and then a queue header, and in the queue header, and this elevated tells it where it's going to appear, the queue toolbar, and there's a Q button. So if we think about Vue, where everything started with the letter V dash, everything in Quasar is starting with a Q dash, and some of the features that are in here. So it looks very similar, though, although it's putting in a Q bar title. You don't see a lot of generic HTML components. Everything is pretty much done with these Q. And there's a reason for that, because the actual experience is a lot nicer of what you want to be able to pull into it. So it's got this item that's up here. Now, this is simply the layout of the page. And the way this works is that how does it know what the actual look is going to be? It also has pages down here. It has our index page, which is our main page. And if I just clicked on our index page, we can see right here that it doesn't really have an awful lot to it. In your main page, it's simply saying, here's my template, here's an image, and this is all I'm doing. In fact, actually, I'm just going to comment out this little piece down here until we take a look at it. And now if I look at our core application, this is what it looks like. Not a lot of changes that are in here. This is just simply the logo. But all of this core stuff that's happening outside of it is happening within that template. So I've got this main layout that controls what my core application looks like. And then I've got these individual pages so I can actually focus on the content of each individual page. Now down below here, I have this folder called router. And what routers do, routes are basically telling you, are like the traffic cop. They're telling things where to go when certain things occur. So in my main application here, I can see localhost. I'm just pointing to a route of localhost. If you're used to working with a lot of applications, you end up seeing more of a URL that comes in after this to tell things where to go. So if I type in something such as, if I type in and say FoxFest, it comes back and says, oops, nothing to show here. So it obviously didn't know what I was dealing with. These are called routes. And inside of routes, you can, inside of the router, you see this routes.js. And here's how it's controlling it. So it's saying routes, the main path here, it tells it what template or what layout to give in the background, in this case, the main layout, and then it imports that into index.view. Likewise, if I want to create another one here, I just created one here called customer, and it's going to customer.view. If I wanted to, so I have a view down here, one called customer. If I flip over to my application and I just type in one in here and say customer, I have a customer page. if we come back to the other example that we were working with, or the one that we were just talking about, I'm just going to copy it. And I'm going to say one called Foxfest. And I'm going to say, well, I want to create a page. I'm going to call it Foxfest. Now I've created this page called Foxfest. Now, when I run, you'll notice that it's saying it could not compile because it's looking for this foxfest.view. So I'm just going to take an existing file page that we have, and I'm just going to rename it to foxfest.view. My application compiles properly, and if I flip over back to my entry in here, I come down and say Foxfest. Now I'm at this Foxfest page. I can always go to Customers, Customer in this case, and I can see the details of customer, or I can always just come right back to the home page if I needed to, and brings me right back to home. This actually introduces another key thing about Vue that's kind of handy, is that since it's reactive, it typically likes to think of itself as a single page application. And by that, I mean, when you're on a single page, you can do a lot of functionality all on its own. All of the logic can be located directly in there. So if you're used to dealing with a web application where you're constantly flipping from page to page, in Vue and in Quasar, you don't really need to do that. You can certainly do it if you need to, but here could be the page that you do all of your customer entry from. So let's take a quick look at this customer page. And so over here is customer page, and we come back to the type of things that we're dealing with here. If I wanted to look at, you can see right here in some code, customer name, active, options. These are kind of common things that we're looking at here. It's just an input, and it's using a Q input, and it's flat. It's giving it a label and then a name. In this case, it's just saying customer name is the value. If I wanted to, I could simply put in, and I'm just going to put this right in here. I'm going to vModel this customer name as well. So this is what we were dealing with before. If you recall, if you remember in our sample Vue application, we were just using a regular HTML input. And so if I come back over to our customer page here, we have, this is our customer, this is our main customer page. And then this down here is this input that's being used by Quasar that's called its Q input field. So I type in the regular input, kind of comes up here and says, okay, hello. We can see it's immediately filling in. Now, if you were building a traditional application, you might say, oh, well, I need to put a label up here. So I'm going to say customer name, colon, and you've put it like that. And so now it looks more like this. Well, if you've built web applications, you know that that can get kind of heavy and you're looking at it. What Quasar has done is it said, okay, well, you can always build them this way if you'd like to, but their interface out of the box is one that actually, an input box, has this property that we saw earlier on called label. And that's this field right here. So it looks like a underline. And we'll talk a little bit about the styling on this in just a moment. But the styling is here, and it has the word name. And as soon as I start typing in it, you'll notice that the name field just kind of disappears, and it goes up in the lower upper left-hand side, just so it's out of the way. And this is useful for a couple of reasons. If you've built an application for the web, accessibility is a very big thing. I know Tamara's actually done a couple of sessions on accessibility going back years, and accessibility isn't just for useful pieces of that. It actually has now transformed the entire way web applications get built. And so when a screen reader comes along to a web-based application and it sees a couple of components, it has to read them separately. So if you've dragged them around a little bit, it can get kind of tricky. The Quasar approach basically is put them all into one nice little box. And so from an accessibility perspective, you can generally feel where things are right away. Now, I come under here and I type in what I'm working with in here, customer name or hello or what have you. And here is as I said, here's my input. I'm using a flat input. And here, once again, is where my customer name is coming in. And it's saying null. So this is kind of the beginning of where we might start building an application. And we're going to head into data in just a moment. But a couple of other key things to note inside of the Vue experience, or the Quasar experience, rather. So I've got my core application that's sitting here that's doing a few things. One of the key things that we like to do in FoxPro sometimes is have a wait window that appears. And so if you were to build one, you can build one from scratch and have it pop up wherever you needed to by creating some HTML. But one of the nice things inside of Quasar is they have access to this queue and a thing called notify. And notify kind of works this way. And so looking at this the script down below here under index.vue, you'll see previously we were always dealing with this thing called data, where we're returning. Well, they also have an entry here called mounted, which fires just like if you imagine FoxPro, the old acronym of Lisa, where you have load, init, show, and activate. Mounted occurs when things actually appear and when the actual page has been mounted onto the system. And this .notify is just a little object that takes a couple of parameters that tells you what the message is going to be. So I'm just going to add this in here. And if I come back to our main page of the application, you'll notice that down below at the very bottom, the hello popped up from down below. And you can actually rearrange this anywhere on the screen. So instead of having to build your own for a lot of key pieces, the Quasar interface has actually given you access to a lot of these things directly. And as I said, you can have a little bit of fun with this because you can move it around to different areas on the screen. There's a position, there's a color if you wanted to. So you could actually say color red. Now it's in red. I think the correct thing here is position. Top. Now it's moved around. So it is fairly intuitive the way you want to work around with things. It's not a lot of learning, heavy duty of, I got to set CSS classes or a lot of things. You can actually move these things around a lot and take them to the next level. So we're going to take that to the next level because right now all we've been doing is building some visual interface aspects of it. But what we really want to talk about, I started off this discussion talking about data and how FoxPro developers get data. Well, let's get back into data as we talk about it, as we look at how we can further take Vue in Quasar to the next level. So I'm going to stop my application that's running here, and we're going to come back to this. But first, we'll start off by coming back down to our samples of code. And I'm going to flip over to FoxPro now. So I've got a FoxPro window that's open here. And when we're talking about data on Quasar and so forth, we're always talking about JSON. And we already took a look at some starting points of JSON, but JSON is kind of the easier way of reading files. I mean, we can actually see this directly on this web connection REST service piece that actually returns back. And we saw a couple of other examples like this, where all JSON is a different notation of storing information. So if we were used to, for example, inside of FoxPro, if you've built with FoxPro before, you're probably used to a lot of the examples of XML, right? And what XML looks like. So if we were taking a look at, basic JSON here, XML might have something that says data, customer, ID 5, and then the customer name, and so forth. Very functional. You can see the structure on it. But if you've got a lot of complexity in it, it becomes kind of tricky to work with. Instead, JSON, on the other hand, can look a little bit easier to read. Now, I agree, looking at a small sample like this, it can see, well, they're just semantics of each other. But from a readability perspective later on, they definitely become a lot easier to work with. Now, in VFP, how do you deal with JSON? Because VFP has these great functions already to deal with XML. I mean, if I'm looking at a table of customers, I can always use some of the cursor to XML. and move these areas over and then take a look at this. Now, pull over. Oops, too many documents. There we go. See, and helps if I type it in properly here. So I have an LC down here, and it's created this huge XML structure. That's built in. How do you deal with that, compare that with what's in for JSON? Well, in JSON, there's, as I mentioned earlier, Westwind has its own JSON engine and its REST service, but there's also these great tools that you can find in VFPX, the Visual Foxborough open source project, that are called NF. NF, JSON read, NF, so forth, and so forth. So if we take a look at a sample project here, I'm just going to take a look at this program here called sample object. Make it a little bit bigger here. If I use my customers, and if you're used to dealing with objects, you're basically going to you may export it out to a name. And I'm just going to quickly run this out here so we can see how it. I'm just going to run this directly to our screen here. And if I just run this, what it's done is it's taken my customer entry, and here's that row that it was looking at, simple table of narwhal, active, and location, and it's converted it directly into an object notation. So this is JSON that you'd actually work with, exactly like we were working with in Vue. So if you're building a web-based application, or you're building even a desktop-style application and you want to store data either temporarily or permanently in JSON, you have a tool to do that. Now that's using a pretty simple object. And the NF JSON, if we look at that syntax again, that's using JSON create. But if you've also got an object already created, you can actually use JSON read, and it will create an object for you. So in this case, I'm just going to say LO. I'm going to say LO equals null for now. And I run this again. And I actually ask for what is the value of LO. And it's telling me that LO is simply an object. Well, what object did it just create? Pull up the debugger here. And let's just make this a little bit bigger for you. So here's my object, and again, here are the pieces of that object already created. So as a developer, you're probably already used to dealing with objects and as they work with. And the nice thing here is that the NF fields can actually just create whatever it needs to. So if I come up with its own brand new syntax of what I want to deal with here, so I'm just going to say, here's some LC JSON, and I'm going to say this JSON has a field called session, and it's going to be a session called Quasar, and it's got another one called attendees, and maybe it has an entry that comes back here and said, well, I'm hoping for 550,000 people, maybe, right? So I've got the entry that's in here, and basically this is just some JSON script here. By using that object now, I can just say, okay, I'm going to say LO equals NF JSON read LC JSON. Whoops, if I can type it in properly. In this case, it's coming back with some errors of what it's looking for, because what it's dealing with, it's needing a couple pieces of information that's in here. And under session, it's got this. So we can actually see a little bit of the details as to how it's coming in. So if I look at do my sample object again, and we'll just my sample object again has a little bit more of the detail as to what it's doing. In this case, it's expecting the double quotes as to what it's pulling down into. So JSON can be kind of finicky with the values that it's using. So sometimes you end up having to play with it just a little bit to get it working just exactly the way you need to. And so I've got it in here. And now I can pull it in here. Now I've got this object. I say what's LO, it's an object again. If I flip back to our debugger, and here's LO, it's just created this object of what I can work with. And this is really handy to have because now you can, I mean, if you imagine, you can now take a Fox Pro application that's working with data and so forth and export out that data to a JSON format or to whatever in order to build additional applications. And JSON isn't just there, it's in a variety of places. So they also have a couple of, I mean, that was a quick and easy sample of it, but you also have cursors. So if I take a look at sample cursors, it has a cursor to JSON. And so if I just run cursor to JSON right now, and what is it created? It has created this value of data. It's telling me it's an array of values. Here's how many records, and it's giving me JSON for all of that detail. It looks a little bit too tricky, so I'm just going to actually pass it a second parameter of true. And if I just play it ahead for you, you can see now that it's simply giving a collection, and the collection is in the square braces around, with each of the rows that are down here. So this gives us a little bit more information and detail as to how we want to work with it in Fox Pro. But if you're dealing with it in a lot of our other environments, you can also take advantage of it too. So for example, if you're dealing with SQL Server, once again, it's a Microsoft product. Back when Microsoft was really heavily on XML, that's where they added all of their XML support. But they've now moved along and created some really useful JSON functions inside of SQL. So you can actually just run view, I'm just doing a select for JSON auto. And what this does is it comes back and it gives me JSON control. What does this actually look like? I'm just going to open it up here. And now you can see it's actually giving me a very similar to what we did with the NF VFPX functions. It's actually now giving me, here it is, the JSON that I'm working with. Now you may look at this and go, okay, well, that's not quite the way I want it to look like. I can actually say, okay, well, I'm going to put a root around it. And this now gives me the JSON once again. But now it puts it into a bracket within the thing called customers. So again, I can see now more details as to the content of what I'm looking at. Now, these notations are pretty simple in their context, right? They basically have one field, one value, one field, one value. If you think about your traditional objects in Fox Pro or in other environments, you may actually have multiple hierarchies on them. Well, in SQL, you can support that as well. I've got this entry down here. I'm going to close this down here. We don't need to save this. And in this case, I'm saying customer, active name, but I'm saying country ID. I want it to appear as country.id and country.english. And again, at the end, I'm saying for JSON path. Now, when I run this function, once again, I get some output in JSON. And I'm just going to take a look at it. And now you can see what it's actually starting to build is this hierarchy of data. So now you actually have hierarchical data of the information that you want to have showing up here. So whatever environment you want to work with, you can get JSON out of it. And we just took a look at VFP, a couple of examples in VFP and a couple of examples in SQL. But there's a large, almost every system now, web-based system or APIs, they've moved away a lot from using the XML format and are supporting more of this traditional JSON format, which makes it a lot easier to read and work with. And for the next part of these examples that we're going to look at, we're going to take a look at we're going to look at the JSON output that comes from a tool that I like to use for quick and easy systems, and it's a web-based system, and it's called Airtable. Now, Airtable is I'm just going to pull it up actually here as a separate window here, just so you can quickly see. Airtable is an online application database, and it basically, here's a quick example of what we were looking at. It's a table, it's a grid view, it's got a column called name, locations, test field. It's got some other items in here, some notes, an ID field. It's basically just a regular table structure. Well, Airtable has an API that's accessible, and that API, again, returns back JSON. So, oops, flipping back over here. Here's this area here, some syntax. And if I wanted to get a list of records, here's a sample of that code, I can see now that it's going to return back to me this set of data, and it's in a JSON format. So all of this to get at is saying that JSON is a format that you probably want to get comfortable with, because it is a format that's easy to write, easy to read, and it actually has a lot of flexibility with what you're doing. And JSON just doesn't have to be used just for data per se. It can also be used for a variety of things. In fact, Visual Studio Code, if you work with it a little bit more detail, you'll go to the settings. And if you look over at settings, in Visual Studio Code, it looks like it's very specific, right? They've got very specific groupings of where their settings are. But if you go down a little bit further into it, what you can see is that these files are all of these settings are actually located in a file called settings.json. So in edit in settings.json, here is that JSON file. So you can use JSON not just for storing data or storing it in a thing and using it as a pass-through. You can also use it for actively storing live data and working with it as you need to. And the samples that we see in the sample application that are available from the GitHub site, you'll be able to get a little bit more feels on. So the key thing here to be afraid is that the JSON can be very useful for a variety of purposes. And we'll take a look at another example of this right now. It's not going to save my changes because these are from settings. And I'll just close out of some of these. Yeah, we don't need to see this anymore. Okay. So back to our application. Inside our core application, we ended up having, as we saw earlier on, we have this nice big virtual FoxFest app. We have a customers table. We have a couple of different pages of what we're looking at. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to switch over. We're going to take a quick look at a slightly different version of this that I've built up here. And I'm just going to flip over to this version. And again, this is going to be using Airtable for a lot of the things that we're looking at here. So I'm just going to type Quasar Dev. Again, Quasar Dev simply builds this environment from what we're actually working with. And it pulls up some of the items. Now, while this is building, here's that settings folder. Now, here's the source code folder that what we're looking at. And so we can see here, I've got components that are listed here. I've got some I18N, which we'll talk about in a moment. And we've got different pages. And then I have this roots. We saw roots earlier on. I've got one, just the main one. And then I've also got one here called Airtable. And I've also got another one down here called lists. And if I look in the components, I can actually see a couple of these other items that are listed down here as well. So if I go to the page of Airtable, I can see that it's referencing Airtable list and Airtable edit. So it's all working together in its essence. And if we take a look at this application that it's built, here's the sample application, or the initial part of the sample application. It's got a header, Quasar app. Quasar is a logo that it's put on it. A sample component, which we'll take a look at it, which the content of it is. But if you notice down below here, we have virtual FoxFest, turn on highlighting, yes or no. Well, that's actually coming. Here's the startup logo. I'm importing in these settings from a folder. And if I look at where these settings are, they're in this folder called assets. And so there's one here called assets, and here's one called settings. And so here are the settings that I'm pulling in from. So here's this external folder for assets that can be used for dropping files into, for storing my settings and what have you. And inside that index page, I'm importing those settings, and then I'm referencing them as part of my data. So as I reference them as part of my data, I can now display them directly up here. So that's where we end up seeing these values of what's appearing here. There's my virtual FoxFest, turn on highlighting equals false, is actually all coming from, there's my conference name, and then I had another one down here, which is pointing to turn on highlighting false. So I can reference these values directly, either by calling them outright, just like info2, or I can also come under here and actually reference the individual field names. So the settings that we had here had one for year as well. So I can just come in here and just change this and say I want info.year. And now it's changed the value that's showing up here. So now I'm pulling data in from external JSON. And we're going to take this one step further now and actually talk about dealing with actual data. Now, how do we deal with real data? That's where, if you recall, when we first created our application, it referenced this thing called Axios. And what Axios does is it pulls data down from an external site, be a web service, a website, a REST service, however we're building it. And so I'm going to flip over to this table. Actually, I'm going to come over to this Airtable example. And in our main page here, we have sample, and it's referencing this sample code. And inside sample, I'm just asking for the info value. It's a sample component. It's saying info. In this case, it's saying info is just simply this object that's coming back. And then here's the key part of this. It's saying axios.get, and it's then passing whatever the parameter is. In this case, it's a parameter specifically to the Airtable setting that's actually pulling me back a list of information. And so in this case, it's pulling me back an individual table. So if I come down and look at our core application here, there's the data that it's coming back with. Now, if I come back to this entry here, and I'm just going to quickly change this to pulling down another field down here. You'll notice that nothing's coming back. And nothing's coming back here because it's not actually referencing some of the fields that are coming back. This thing didn't come back with a thing called fields. I'm just saying I want to get the response from this, and I'm putting it into a table. I'm just going to say, get rid of the dot fields. So now, here are the results that came back just from calling that Airtable. So if you're calling, and we took a look earlier on with the Westwind Connect, the Westwind Connect example would return back various things. So if you're using Westwind Connect, or you're writing your own, or you're dealing with third-party services, pulling these things down, like AWS, Firebase, a variety of these tools can return back the JSON that you need. In addition, if you're building an MVC application in Visual Studio or in a variety of applications, they will return back that with various syntaxes of what you're working with. So we started off by looking at some very simplistic why you can use Quasar to deal with things, and Quasar has some interesting pieces. Well, let's take a look at some real useful pieces, because as with Fox Pro, as with most applications, the interfaces that you have only really matter if you can deal with data in them. And so this is where it really becomes useful. I don't think I've shown anything too frightening to follow at this stage. So at this case, we're just going to go over to tables. This is a little link on here. And here's the data that it's returning. But here's the data that we're returning right here. And if I take a look at this, this is tables. So if we come over to my sample application here and look at my roots, when I just say, and in this case, I'm actually referring to lists, and I can see that I'm referring to lists if I look at my application. I'm looking at lists up here. So I'm going to go take a look at lists, and inside of lists, I've simply got lists.customers, and it's saying info.lists. And I'm importing this list from a JSON file, from a static JSON file here, just to make it easier to look at. And this static JSON file looks like this. This is very similar to what we saw generated by SQL Server, as well as what we saw generated by the NF-JSON components. So it's very standard JSON of what it's pulling down. And in this list, we can see we have a little table. And in the white paper, it goes through some specifics on this syntax for this. But you have a markup table, which is kind of just like dealing with a standard HTML markup table, which, and I'm just going to pull up the sample of it here so you can see. And we were looking at lists. So here's a markup table. Once again, we're using Q markup table, which has a header. We're just putting name active. And then we're using another function that's in Vue, not just Quasar, but Vue, that's called v4. which actually loops through all of the rows, and we can just specify, in this case, what we're showing in. And it's a very basic table, as though you were writing it from scratch. The real value in Quasar, as I was saying earlier, comes from all of the individual application-specific components that it's designed for. So in this case, we're going to use this other one here called QTable. And QTable is referencing info.customers. So coming back to that table that we had, it's referring back to info.customers. And all I'm doing here is I'm specifying data. I'm saying data equals info.customers. From a syntax perspective, just so you're aware, whenever you see a colon, it's simply telling it that it's going to reference, it's basically doing substitution, macro substitution or references. So it's saying, I'm looking for data in info.customers as an object. And when I do that, here's the table that it's now created. So instead of having to go through manually and creating these individual fields, what I'm doing here is I've now just called Quasar's QTable, specifying the data, and it's now put in automatically. It's got a table that highlights automatically. It has built-in sorting. You can notice it down below here. It actually identifies records per page, so it actually is doing some form of paging that's on it. And you can immediately see how valuable this can be when you're building it. And that's simply out of the box. As I said, just not even 3 lines. It's really 1 line of code if you imagine how it's set up. It's just saying info.customers and pulling it down. And that's really all it needs to do. This other stuff that was up here, we can come back down to, we'll come to take a look at in other ones. But realistically, all we needed to have in here was info.lists. We're telling import lists from the list.json. And then this 1 line deals with this. So that was actually hard-coded. If we flip over now to our other example, which is here going over to the Airtable, if you recall when we dealt with Airtable, it returned back some pretty funky data for this. I mean, the Airtable, here's the listing of customers, and it gives me back this thing called records and individual fields, and it's kind of a lot of detail, extra header stuff that may be in there. Well, inside of Quasar, what we can do, and this is actually going to be stored in our Airtable.list, and I'll show how this works right now. I click over to Airtable sample, taking me over to a root called Airtable. And if we looked in our table here, we see Airtable.view, and our Airtable.view, it actually is referencing Airtable list and Airtable edit, and it's using that sample of vif right here of what we're working with. So it's only going to show the list if I've got this checkbox checked. So I choose that. So couple of examples here. Here's the data that came back from the Axios call. So it's actually calling the Axios call, calling up to that web service, and then returning back this data. This was that default view, because basically it says ID, fields, and then it has the created time. But down below, you can see it's showing a little bit more some specific information. And the way we do that is, here's that call to get back that data. And Axios is very handy because you can use it for putting information. So you can actually use it for updating information as well as getting back information. And so it's this dot response, it's putting it into here. It has some area for where the info is. And in this case, we're saying q.table, info.record. So it's dealing with exactly the same piece of information. But what it's doing is it's going through each one. And we looked earlier on at this concept of props. And that's generally what it's doing as well. It's saying, for each row, I want to show the name, location, and active. So it's giving a lot more detail and wrapping it around how those lists work. So you have a lot more control over the level of data that you need to necessarily show in the results you get back. So that's tables. And then if you want to take a look at a little bit more of the detail of the user interface, is we can come under here and edit examples. We looked earlier on at the edit field. If you recall, the edit field that we saw in the first application looked kind of boring. It just had a single line moving across. Well, in this case, we actually have it looks more like a regular text box. If we take a look at that sample here under Airtable edit, it says, once again, Q input. It's getting the data. This data is coming from that Airtable, so it's doing a specific reference to the Airtable API. And then it's passing some things. I'm saying it's clearable, and I'm saying it's outlined. That's all the parameters I need to put in here. And now I've got this nice box around everything. I've got this automatic icon for filling things in. And because it's live, as you can see here, I'm typing it, and it's changing it live directly up here. And that's because of the value of view that's in it. Now, the entire Quasar experience has a lot of other features in here. I'm just going to quickly hit on some of the more data entry specific. I come down here, I can do a select, a drop down. So here I'm not doing any of the special outline features. I just have a regular drop down of items that are in here. Here's a Canada, US type of thing. And you can see it's live changing this data here. If I come down and say I'm going to do an object select, again, it's using this drop down that's here. I'm going to come back to this code and say, instead of doing that, I want it to be outlined. So I just need to type in outlined. And now it's got a nicer interface as to what it's going to be looking like. If I take a look at another example down here, we have calendar. It's got a nice built-in calendar control. So when I'm pulling in calendar controls or I'm pulling in dates and what have you, I can actually show these items. And I'm just going to quickly get rid of this VF because I'm not pulling it down properly, obviously. And so here's my date control, and it pulls down a nice calendar. And so what Quasar has done is they've built on top of Vue all of these various very cool components that are in the system. Now, I know I only have a few little bit left, so we're definitely going to want to take this a little bit offline into the Q&A session. But one of the other cool parts about Vue, and all of the stuff that we're building right here is all web-based applications. But one of the very cool parts about Vue is that you can take what you've built here and simply generate it into a desktop application. So I come to my regular examples of what I've built here. I've got my queue, I've got my application down below here. And if I want to build this to distribute the application, I use Quasar dev to run it in development mode. I type Quasar build, and it will build a distribution folder. And inside that distribution folder, it will have a single page application, and it has an index.html and all of the details here. So I can just say build, and it will do that build for me. What I can also, though, do is I can come down here and I can say, oh, I want it to build a Electron application. And if you're not familiar with Electron, it's basically a node-based application application platform that can run under any environment that it needs to. So I'm just going to say build for Electron. And when it finishes building, it's actually going to, inside that folder, inside that dist folder, we're noticing down here, it's creating an Electron folder. And inside that Electron folder, it's going to have that whole application that's pulled in there. So I'm just going to pull this out here, let it finish building. I'm going to come over to my folders down here, where we have our Quasar sample, which is this is the application that's sitting on your piece that's sitting on your in the sample application. And there's the application folder that it created. It finished running it. And inside here, here's simply my application, my first application. It's running here. I double click on it, and now it runs a desktop, full desktop application, what we've seen, that runs exactly the same way. Here's our tables. Here's our views. So all of the same context of what we're building, we can build directly in one environment and take it to each of those other environments. I can see I'm getting very close to the end. So quickly to point a couple of things. In the white paper, we talk a lot about a couple of other cool things that are in here, especially about how to set up the application environment. We talked a little bit about assets. This area here called boot allows you to define, for example, custom functions. So I've got this global entry here, and I've created a custom function. So that means all of my applications can access this custom function. And the way they access it is simply inside of the code If we look at some of our code down here, we say this dot. I also now have access to my custom function of this dot, and I can have get date or get Q date string, and all of the other, get date string. And so you have access to those various other pieces on here. I mentioned earlier on, you've got a lot of components. You also can define here components and just load them all in. So instead of having to remember to import them all individually, you can put them in one place. And then when you're building your actual application, you just have to reference them directly as here. So it makes it a lot easier to build with. So coming back down to the real values inside of the Quasar environment here, I'm just going to quickly jump over to the very, very end so you can actually get to fill in evaluations and so forth. In the final scheme of things, Quasar ends up being a very nice environment for building, and I'm going to say very cool types of applications. You can get their website, quasar.dev, lots of key core information, lots of details on there. In the white paper, that goes through a lot more detailed examples, and then the sample in GitHub does carry over a couple of the data on here. So it is 1 minute past my time. And I know Tamar's ready to jump in on me here. So thank you very much. Please fill out the evaluation, and I'll be heading over into the separate room if you do have any questions and answers, and we can go through a couple more examples if we need to. Thank you.